Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello everyone, Pat Flynn here, and welcome back. I have joining me again Dr. Gerard Verschuuren. He has a specialty in human genetics. He's also a philosopher of science, and we are discussing his new book where he systematically analyzes some of the most destructive doctrines of our age. And while we won't have time to get through all of them, I really wanted to bring this book to your attention and spend some time talking with Dr. Verschuuren on just a few of these destructive doctrines, things like relativism or syncretism. And his book covers a lot. It's a really nice survey and a great apologetic. I can't recommend it enough. Unfortunately, I have to apologize that the first very few minutes of this episode got cut off. There were a few technical difficulties, so you'll miss the initial introduction. But where it picks up, Dr. Verschuuren is talking about how in culture we really just more or less breathe without realizing that we're really often assuming an ideology that can be very hazardous to the way that we live, ultimately our eternal happiness and flourishing. So that's where the interview picks up. It might seem a little bit abrupt, and I apologize for that, but you really didn't miss any of the meat of the episode. So that's where we're kicking in, and I will pass it along to the interview right now. Hope you enjoy. Talk to you soon.
I always compare it with this. We breathe every second almost. We inhale air and we exhale it. But what we inhale can have a lot of bad stuff in it that we don't even know. So we have developed all kinds of tests. Is there carbon monoxide in the air? If it's a little bit, we won't have any idea. Mm-hmm. Once we have an idea, it's too late. So why are we not doing the media, in academia? We get, bombarded with all kinds of doctrines. I just mentioned relativism, but there are 14 more at least in my book called The Destructive Doctrines of Our Age. I discuss 15 different doctrines that I think are very destructive.
So you have a doctorate in science. You have a doctorate in philosophy of science.
Yes.
You sound like just the man to talk to on these topics. And I'm looking at the table of contents of your book right now, and you take what seems to be a very thorough examination of I agree, these are all very destructive doctrines that people more or less kind of just assume by breathing them in, depending on the culture that they're brought up in or the institution where they receive their education. Now, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, and of course I'm going to encourage people to pick up a copy of this book, but I would like to get to a few. So you have relativism, you have syncretism, Gnosticism, secularism, liberalism, communism, materialism, spiritism. I haven't heard that one is phrased exactly like that before. Scientism, evolutionism. So very sort of a wide swath of doctrines that you're examining here. If you had to pick just one, Dr. Verschuuren, that you'd like to begin to highlight to our audience, one that you think might be particularly destructive to, let's say younger people, younger generation, which one would you like to start with here?
I think, though it sounds very abstract, the first one of my list of 15, because I think that is the reason why all those other ones have a chance to develop. That's why but it is very destructive because we don't really know why they are wrong. In relativism, it says there is nothing really wrong. If you think something, that's your right, as they call it, and you can think whatever you want. But at the moment we say that, then we are really in trouble. Then we have no more connection with the world around us. We can just believe whatever we want. And that, I think, is very dangerous. I would say if there is no connection between what is out there, I call that reality, and what is in our minds, what we come up with on our own, then there is no way to check our thoughts anymore. There is no reality check. So all the ideologies or doctrines we hear around us, they think, yeah, why not? That sounds fine to me. It's my opinion. But opinions we hear around us, they think, yeah, why not? That sounds fine to me. It's my opinion. But opinions are not necessarily true. If it's my opinion that the world is flat, that does not make the world flat. So how do we check things? Philosophy is an important tool. Science is an important tool, but unfortunately science is not very helpful when it comes to ideologies. But still, we are brought up in school with whatever you think is fine. If you think something is true from your perspective, then it must be true, which is kind of weird and actually very dangerous. So I would say, let's fight relativism.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think you're right here, because I think this opens up the gate to a lot of these other doctrines, especially things like syncretism and liberalism in a sort of ethical sense. You have your values, I have mine, and as long as we don't just, kill each other, everything's okay. But relativism actually goes deeper than that, doesn't it? There's a very strong form of relativism which would deny that we can even really know any objective truth at all. So what's the important background we need to know about this particular doctrine, and what's wrong with it? Why should we reject relativism?
Yeah, first of all, relativism itself is a little bit contradictory, for it says there are no truths and false issues and untruths or lies or whatever. But if that's true, then you are really claiming that your idea of relativism is true. So you, at the same time, you are denying what you are saying. Mm-hmm. Or if I say I know it, but of course I just might be mistaken, what is that word mistaken based on? There must, of course I just might be mistaken. What is that word mistaken based on? There must be something that we can check it on. If there is no objective truth, we are free to believe whatever we like, including utter nonsense. And unfortunately, that's what we hear around us. You see it in newspapers, you hear it on radio and TV. A lot of people have just declared whatever they wanted to do. So that's one problem of relativism. Second one, I mentioned that already, opinions cannot change facts. So if we change the way the world actually looks to us, that doesn't make that the world is like that. So that's another problem. Then there is a more serious one. As I said already, it contradicts itself. There is no such thing as objective truth, and then at the same time it claims that that is objectively true. That cannot be true at the same time. That there is objective truth means that you are insisting in your denial that what you say is objectively true, which is impossible.
It's kind of like trying to deny the law of non-contradiction, isn't it? You sort of have to assume it to even begin to argue against it.
Yes, correct. Yeah, you said that very well.
So sorry, go ahead and continue.
Another problem with relativism is it says whatever we think in our head came to us through evolution. We got that from the animal world, but that doesn't mean that there is still truth. Natural selection, which is one of those key words in modern biology, natural selection selects what fits in the world we live in. But there is so much in our knowledge that will be perfectly fine for natural selection. Natural selection will not select whether you believe in the heliocentrism with the sun in the center of the world or in the center of our planetary system, or whether you believe in geocentrism, that the earth is in the center of everything. Natural selection doesn't care about that. And when we claim certain truths in mathematics, natural selection doesn't care whether you know what a prime number is or whatever. That is much fancier than natural selection can ever select. So relativism is usually claimed by those kind of people that say natural selection determines what is true or false. That is complete nonsense. For if that were the case, then I can't even say that natural selection is the explanation, for I'm claiming some truth that cannot be tested by natural selection. The natural selection. That's very deep, highbrow philosophy. So let's leave it at that.
Well, I think it's an important point is the idea of that if all of our beliefs are just formed through through the process of mutation and selection, then it seems like, okay, all right, well, if that's just aimed at fitness and not necessarily aimed at truth, then there might be a problem there with trusting the reliability of any of our cognitive faculties.
Yes.
If you start to push that too far. But even if that's the case, it would seem, you're right, it doesn't seem like natural selection, okay, maybe it could reliably shape some of our perceptual experience, like, the fact that I'm touching a table right now, that might be reliable, but I don't see how it could possibly touch the things like you've said, philosophical beliefs, mathematical reasoning, modus ponens, things like that, right?
Correct. And besides, all we do, we have come up with a discovery that no natural selection could have ever told us that. I always say when Darwin said that everything is explained by natural selection, then I say, if that is the case, Darwin, then your theory of natural selection is worth nothing. It has nothing to be based on. So he is actually cutting the branch he was sitting on. Mm-hmm. And that is, I would say, suicidal.
And this is why philosophy is important, right? Because it can help us to check the assumptions that a lot of the sciences leave more or less unexamined a lot of the time, right?
Correct. Yeah, you said that very well.
And I think that might be a tie-in to one of the other doctrines that I do think is especially pervasive among younger generations. And you tell me if you have another spot you wanted to hop to, but I would love to get your take on scientism, because this, especially among people, even my age, I'm in the millennial generation, this seems to be extremely pervasive and very pernicious. So if that's okay with you, I'd like to hear your view on this as somebody who has an extensive background both in science and philosophy. What is scientism, and why is it a destructive doctrine?
I like science. I'm sure no one will be surprised about that. But what I don't like is scientism, because it's a philosophical viewpoint. It has nothing to do with science. Science can never prove that scientism is correct. For scientism says everything that science says is the whole truth. There is nothing else but that. But scientism is very doubtful. There are a lot of problems with scientism. To claim that science is all we can know, and that science has answers to all we can know, and that science has answers to all our questions, that is, first of all, it's very, very demanding. But secondly, it cannot happen. What scientism does, it declares science as the only method to study the world. But how can that be true? Science is just one of the techniques to do things. And it may be a good technique, but as I always say, if you have a metal detector that does a beautiful job, that does not mean that all the world is made of metal. Mm-hmm. Metals are just one of the issues we try to capture with a metal detector. Scientism is basically saying whatever tools science has can tell us everything, and that's not possible. Another problem is that when you make a statement about science, and you can only do that from outside science. You cannot do that from inside. So you cannot test scientism with the same tools and methods that science uses. There is no way you can do that. And besides, to say that everything is mathematical or everything is quantable, countable, it can be measured, dissected, and whatever, that doesn't mean there is anything else. I always like to quote Albert Einstein's office saying that said, not everything that can be counted, count. And not everything that counts can be counted. And another physicist said, that was Erwin Schrödinger, science knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. There are so many more questions that science can never answer. Yeah, it can deny those questions, but that's not an answer. Denying it doesn't mean that you can just throw it away. If I go into that issue, then we have to see that there is much more. The philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend, once said, science should be taught as one view among many, and not as the one and only road to truth and reality. Mm-hmm. If someone falls in love, and that is definitely not a scientific issue, if someone falls in love, that is not a matter of falling onto the earth because of gravity. There is no gravity involved there. So there is something more to the world than gravity. There is more to the world than physics. There is more to the world than biology. And what is that more? Religion has an answer to those questions.
Yeah. And that's a very reasonable both and rather than either or position to take. And I think we can see that science certainly captures part of the truth. It certainly captures part of the picture, and it captures it really well. But what you're saying, it doesn't necessarily capture the entire picture, correct?
That's my point. Yeah, you said that well. It does not count for everything. There's much more that counts in life. And we can never find answers, for instance, about God's existence. God cannot be manipulated in laboratories. You don't discover God like you discover neutrinos or genes or whatever. God is far above all of that. And I can actually prove, and I try to do that in my books, that if there is no God, we can't even do science, because science assumes that there is order, law and order in the universe. Sometimes we think it's chaotic, but it's regulated by laws of nature. Where do the laws of nature come from? Even famous physicists have sometimes said, the Big Bang explained all of that. That's basically nonsense. For where does the Big Bang come from? And then the famous Stephen Hawking, who passed away a year ago, he said, the universe created itself. How can you create yourself? How can a child create itself? You need a parent to become a child. And the parent need another parent. And where do all the parents come from? Only from God. So the laws of nature have to come from somewhere. And that's where I say only religion has that answer. It can tell us why things are the way they are. And if you say yes, it can tell us why things are the way they are. And if you say, yeah, they just are the way they are, then you are not a philosopher, first of all. But as Albert Einstein always said, scientists are poor philosophers. That means they don't really think deep enough. They do a beautiful job as scientists, but they forget that there is so much more than science.
And that's a really good point. And Stephen Hawking is a good example. And no doubt he was a brilliant physicist at what he did. But just because you're brilliant in one specific area doesn't mean that you can't make often very simple and egregious blunders in others. And the idea of self-creation, as you pointed out, it's philosophically absurd. You would have to exist before you existed to create yourself. But if that was the case, then you wouldn't need to create yourself. And if it wasn't the case, you couldn't have created yourself. So what's going on here?
Perfectly said. Yes, perfectly said.
And it makes you wonder how somebody who's like Stephen Hawking, and no doubt he is. I definitely don't want to downplay him, but it just goes to show, again, you can have great brilliance in one area, but if you don't really train yourself in another area, you can be prone to making otherwise very simple mistakes. Isn't that right?
Because scientists are more and more specialized, and so they know more and more about less and less, basically.
Yeah, until they know everything about nothing, as they say, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's what Comrade Lawrence said. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was a biologist. He said, and ultimately end up knowing nothing.
That's really funny. One more.
Or another thing, just one more image that might help thing. It's we are living on an island, more or less, and on the shore, we are surrounded by what we don't know yet. So when we know more and more, our island gets bigger and bigger and bigger, but that means that what we don't know yet, that is the border with the surroundings, it gets larger and larger too. So we know more and more about.
That's a perfectly salient illustration. I like that a lot. Dr. Verschuuren, if we can squeeze in one more here, I'd be delighted. And even if you can just give us a general overview, just because this is a doctrine that has popped up with such force, and I think it's got people so confused, and then you probably know what I'm talking about. It's genderism. What on earth is going on with genderism? What is it, and how do we navigate this what has really become a political labyrinth in our time?
Oh yeah, it's completely political. I wonder where it comes from. It's very strange. It really became more prevalent when they distinguished sex from gender. Mm-hmm. Sex is determined at the moment of conception. If there is a Y chromosome from the father, then you will be a male. If it's an X chromosome from the father, you will be a female. Mm-hmm. And there is not anything you can do. So what happened is they say, there is much more to being a male and a female, which is true. So it is, for many people, it's a social construct. Mm-hmm. So it's what they call gender is basically what you decide that you want to be. But if you are a male, there is no way you can change that. Even if you have all kind of things done through surgery or whatever, your Y chromosome is still there. And even if you change your birth certificate, you were still born as a boy or a girl. Mm-hmm. And I know how that came out, more or less. That is partially done by social influences. That's why men used to be firefighters, but nowadays also women. In the army, firefighters, but nowadays also women. In the army, the same thing. Women can play that role too, but that doesn't mean they are no longer women. They are still women. Mm-hmm. And whatever you try to do is very dangerous. So the famous Dr. Hughes, he finally changed his mind. He said, instead of changing their genitals, what he used to do in surgery, we should change their minds. So it's in their minds that they are a man or a woman or whatever, but that will never change. Just look at when you have a couple of the same sex, one plays the role of the mother or father, or plays the role of the male or the female, mm-hmm. But there is no way they can ever, in that combination, produce a new child. Yeah, in vitro fertilization, but that's a technique that male animals are different from female animals, and they will never change into the other sex. Because we don't have really gender. There is no gender there because they have no culture to become a male or a female. They could become more masculine or more feminine. That's true. There is no problem about that. And we can learn to play as a boy with toys that are less boy-like, but still you are a boy. Mm-hmm. And that will not change. Even if you think you have changed, then I say you are basically saying that the earth is flat again. But the earth does not become flat because you think so. And that's where we started with relativism. Thinks whatever you think is true, but not everything you think is true because it has to be checked with the facts. Mm-hmm. Or you have to at least find out what is the philosophy, or you have to at least find out what is the philosophy behind it. Where does all that nonsense come from? All those 15 what I call destructive doctrines of our age. Where does it come from?
And this is it's a really, I think, important point, and it's of course it's reassuring to hear the common sense view reiterated by somebody who has a long history specializing in human genetics. But it seems to me that there's also another fundamental problem going on with genderism, and that is if we don't define a man or a woman based on sort of the biological orientation toward a certain reproductive role, then how else can we possibly define a woman? It seems we can either then define a woman by certain social stereotypes, which seems to be exactly what a lot of these political ideologies want to avoid, so that doesn't seem like a good option. Or we just say that a woman is a woman and make the definition totally circular. So and neither of those two alternative options seems plausible to me. So it really seems like the only way we can appropriately define man or woman is in that biological orientation. Otherwise, they become almost entirely meaningless. And then to even want to change doesn't really make any sense anymore.
Yes, correct.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I may add to that, one of the roots of genderism is that we made a distinction between a body and soul, or body and mind, if you find the word soul too heavy. Body and mind. So it makes us look like we are in the prison of our body. But that is a wrong conception of the unity of a person. A person is body and soul. And you cannot say the soul is in the wrong body. But say to yourself, I have the wrong foot. Yeah, unless you have an artificial foot. But otherwise you can't say I have the wrong foot. Mm-hmm. So you can't say I have the wrong body. I have the wrong sex. What kind of talk is that? Mm-hmm. You know, I do not own my body. It is my body in the sense that it's a part of me as a person. Mm-hmm. So mutilating your body is basically an attack not only on the body, but also on the soul of a person who is meant to be a man or a woman, a male or a female. And again, I'm not talking about masculine or feminine. There are men that are more feminine and masculine. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about sex is not a social construct. Gender maybe is, but sex is not.
Mm-hmm. That's really well said, Doctor.
Is not.
Mm-hmm. That's really well said, Dr. Verschuuren. I thank you for taking the time to help shed some light on what I think has really confused, especially the younger generation these days. And it's really helpful to have these conversations. So I want to encourage everybody to get a copy of this new book of yours. I think it's going to be so helpful for people to pick this up and see both the history and the inherent philosophical problems in these destructive doctrines. So, Dr. Verschuuren, where's the best place for people to snag a copy of this?
Amazon.com is a good one. Rout Books is a good one. So, but Amazon is probably for most people easier to find when they go to Amazon.com and they type in basically my last name is enough, Verschuuren, and Destructive Doctrines, and you will find it right there. And I'm glad we only discussed 3 or 4 of those doctrines. For all the other ones, you really have to see the book. For instance, capitalism, communism, very popular items nowadays when we go to the elections. What is evolutionism,
secularism, humanism. You have transhumanism in there. Really interesting stuff. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so too. That's why it's in there.
So again, head over to Amazon or En Route Books and Media and pick up a copy of this wonderful book, The Destructive Doctrines of Our Age. Dr. Gerard Verschuuren, thanks again so much for taking the time to be with me today.
Thank you so much, Pat, for this great.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfoud. Good day.